AngularJS routing. Hello everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget we are going to build a really cool flexible application in AngularJS using client-side routing. Now routing is what you typically think of when you want to route between different pages in your application, load them from the server down to the client, then post up some results and load a new page down to the server. But AngularJS executes entirely on the client side. Well, they have a really neat framework, a really neat library, the route provider, that's going to let us build that routing functionality right inside of our client-side application, right in the client's browser, and it's going to provide all sorts of cool flexibility that you would expect in a server-side application, but instead right here in AngularJS. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at what single-page routing means in the context of AngularJS applications. We'll also then take a look at the route provider, which is the provider that AngularJS exposes that gives us all this cool functionality. Then we will spend the second half of the nugget actually building out a routed application. So we'll look at a single page application that routes to multiple different views. And then lastly, we'll expand that application. We'll make it real complicated and cool and add in some route parameters so that we can collect parameters out of our route URL. Alright, there's a lot to go over, so let's get started. Let's start off by talking about how routing is handled in single versus multi-page web applications. Now you're probably used to working with multi-page web applications. That's kind of the traditional way that web applications are developed. And at a very high level, the way they work is a user makes a request from the web server and a page is handed down to that client PC. Now the client does the work they need to do on their PC, and then they post a result back up to the web server. The web server processes that result and hands a resulting page back to the client. And this goes on, so on and so forth, ad infinitum, back and forth between the client and the server as much as is needed. From a developer standpoint, this model can be a real boon. All of your complexity, all of your processing is really happening on your server side. So you're free to use, whatever technologies you want in the back end, your data storage, your computation, etc. It's all in your hands and under your control. You don't have to worry about what's going on the client PC because, frankly, you don't care. You're just handing off a little tiny page that's going to run and the results are going to get sent up. But there's some challenges working in this model as well. For one thing, maintaining state between each of your pages can be really difficult. So, for instance, the user wants to change something on a page and they expect the next time they look at that page for it to look the same way. Well, you need to make sure that that is carried along with each of your postbacks. So that's a whole bunch of extra information. It's called your application state that's getting sent to the server and back down to the client. And each page has to be programmed to load that state and display that state appropriately. And that segues into some of the other challenges that include the amount of time in traffic that you have going back and forth over the internet between the client PC and the server. The more complex your application, the more data you have, the slower and more cumbersome that whole process is going to be. And you're going to manage it all on the server side. You need to have a real robust server-side technology to manage that whole process. Now to contrast, a single page works a little bit differently. In a single page application, we still send out our request to the web server and the result is passed down to the client PC, but that page that's passed down actually has multiple different pages or multiple different features and functionality built right into it. And instead of posting back the entire page, instead of actually calling an HTTP post, we use asynchronous calls to simply transmit small updates to the server as needed and get small results from the server as needed. So those asynchronous callbacks allow the client side, the client application, to be a lot more responsive and a lot more fluid and flexible while the application is sending up and waiting on results from the server. And it allows you to really reduce the amount of time and internet traffic you're using. On top of that, you don't have to worry about things like application state because everything's contained on this single page. The state is already being stored right there in local memory on the user's PC. But because everything is on the local user's PC, you no longer have access to this great suite of server-side technology to handle all your cool functionality. You're limited to, well, client-side technologies, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you've got to write any kind of real robust application functionality that you want inside of this pretty small suite of tools. And as you and I know, this suite of tools can be a little bit cumbersome and difficult to work with unless we've got access to a nice client-side library, say AngularJS. And what AngularJS does that's so cool is it simulates routing behavior inside of our single page client-side application. So whereas we're used to routing as being sort of a server-side operation, something that happens when the server receives a post or a request from the user's PC and then it routes a new page back down to the user, we're going to simulate that entire environment right inside of our single page application. We'll have multiple views, multiple templates, and they will be associated with multiple different controllers, and we'll be able to navigate between those views and those templates as if they were on the server, but really they're locally on our client-side PC. That means we maintain our state throughout the entire lifetime of this application and all of these routing operations, and we get a really fast, responsive client-side application. Let's take a moment to talk about the route provider exposed by AngularJS to allow us to handle routing inside of our single-page applications. Now first, getting a hold of the route provider, it's a little bit different than anything we've done with AngularJS services in the past. For starters, we're not getting a hold of the route service, we're getting a hold of the route provider, and we do that simply by appending the word provider onto the end of the word route, so it's $route provider. And this will allow us to get the underlying provider for the route service and inject it into our application configuration module. Now the second thing to know is that this provider is not included in AngularJS, at least not in versions 1.2 and above. It's actually been split out into a separate module called ngRoute, and we need to make sure that we include a reference to this ngRoute module when we define our Angular application. Real easily, that's done here when we define our module. We simply include the string ngRoute as a parameter inside of that second object. So that's always been a blank kind of object in the past when we've built our modules. Now we're actually going to supply a value to it. We'll also need to make sure that we reference the routing JavaScript file. So it's not even in the angular.js file. We have a second JS to reference to link into our HTML when we're ready to use routing. Another new thing that we'll be doing to use the route provider is that we're going to be injecting it into the application configuration. That's not something we've done before either. But that's actually real easy to do as well. We're going to take our module and call the .config function, and we're going to pass into that our configuration function, and we're simply going to inject the route provider into the parameters of that function. Just like injecting any other service into any other module, we can inject providers into our configuration function. And it's this configuration function that's going to handle our route definitions. It's basically going to say, okay, for each one of these URLs, here's the view, here's the template that you ought to be using, and in fact, here's the controller on each one of these that you should be using as well. So it's pretty cool. We get to define a view, we get to define a controller that supports that view, and then we get to associate each one of those with a route or with a URL in our application. And to match up the routes to these views that we provide, we're simply going to use a function called .when that's exposed on the route provider. And the .when command is real simple. .when takes two parameters. The first is just the path or the route that we actually want to match up. That's each one of these little guys. So that just says, hey, when we match this path, use this second object, the configuration object, to figure out exactly what we're going to do. And the configuration object has a number of different parameters that we can associate with it. First, it's got a template or a template URL that just says, hey, here's what we're going to show, here's what we're actually going to display for this particular path. The resolve function we won't talk about in this video, but that allows us to set up an asynchronous callback and inject the results into our controller. So we'll talk about that when we look at promises. Redirect to allows us to not show a view, but actually redirect to a different route. Reload on search allows us to handle the location service .search method. And then last, controller, this is an important one, that allows us to associate a controller with the viewer, with the template that we are looking at. So each one of these guys is our template, and each one of these guys is going to be our controller. So let's take a look at it in action now. Routing in Angular can get pretty crazy pretty quick, so we're going to start off real simple and then build up to kind of a full function, full featured routed application. So for starters, notice here that I'm injecting ngRoute into my module, just like we talked about before. So normally those two brackets are blank. Well, now we're passing in the ngRoute module, and that's telling the module, hey, make sure to load the ngRoute library as well. Secondly, you'll notice I'm using the myapp.config function, and I'm just calling a function where I inject the route provider. And again, dependency injection, all I have to do is make sure I name it appropriately, unless I want to use the alternate syntax. Down inside of my configuration function, you can see I'm calling the .when method on the route provider. I'm actually calling it 3 times. Because the when method returns a handle to the route provider itself, I just daisy chain them together. But you could call it in different commands, different statements, each and every one if you wanted, no difference. And just like we talked about, those each provide 2 parameters to the when command. First is a string that represents my route or my path, and second is an object. And in this case, I'm only defining 1 parameter on the object, the template, and all I'm passing into the template is a plain old string. Up in my HTML, there's nothing unusual going on. I am using an additional .js file, angular-route.js. So that just gets a hold of the routing library. So again, remember, not only do I have to inject it into my module, but I also have to make sure that the library is available. Secondly, inside of my app, I'm calling this ng-view directive on this div, and there's nothing inside of that. And all that ng-view is that's the placeholder that indicates where my route templates are going to get loaded on my HTML application. Now let's take a look at how all this works. So very simply, all we're saying with this particular configuration is when we hit this path, say /, take this template string, which reads this is the base URI template, and inject it right here into the ng-view directive. It actually replaces wholesale that div with my template. And you can see that happening right here. This is the base URI template. Because we're on just the / route, it's returning just this result. This is the base URI template. Now we can change that if we want to change our route. We'll just come down here and say a route, and you can immediately see it changes. It updates to read this is a route, and it does that because that's what the template is for the a route. So it gets injected in there. Same thing if we change it to a different route, which we also have defined. You can see it reads this is a different route. And same as before, that's because a different route has that string defined as its template string. So yoink, that's what gets displayed on our page. Now notice that this also means that our back and forward button work. So this is a route, the base URI, etc. So we can move back and forth between these pages just like any other web application. But everything's happening locally on the client's PC. We're not hitting the server over and over to get this information. We're actually doing it asynchronously, which is great. What's not great is using a straight string value for that template. That doesn't give us the ability to have any kind of complex HTML or Angular view logic inside of our templates. It's just a plain old string, and we certainly don't want to be loading string HTML inside of our JavaScript. That would be the worst. So in that case, we're going to use a different parameter of this configuration object, the template URL. Let's take a look at that now. In this version of my application, I'm largely doing the same thing. You can see I've got ng-route injected into my module, calling the config function and passing in the route provider. On route provider, I'm calling my .when commands, and they're largely the same with one little difference. I'm using template URL instead of template, and instead of a string, it's just pointing to an HTML file. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. This HTML file is going to get loaded into my app underneath the ng-view directive. Now one cool thing that happens here is AngularJS uses the template cache service to load these HTML views. So what is actually going to happen is they're not loaded until the first time they're requested. So they're asynchronously on demand loaded from the server. So let's take a look at this in action. I'm just going to change my path here to my -2.html, and there it is. Hello world, big letters, exclamation point. So where did that come from? How did it get hello world? Well, look at the path I'm at. I'm at the / path, which is defined down here in my route, and the resulting template from that is hello world.html. So let's take a look at hello world.html. And this is a very simple HTML view, HTML template. It's just h1 hello world. So that's where it came from. It matched up the path to that file, and it loaded that file. So if I wanted to load my hello Ben route, I could simply type hello Ben in here. And you can see now I've got hello Ben, which is a little bit smaller because for hello Ben I used h3. So the routing grabs the path and it loads up the .html view template. So you can pretty quickly imagine how you would have a large suite of view templates and your routing would handle navigating between them, loading them asynchronously on demand as you needed them, creating a nice, flexible, dynamic client-side application. And let's go ahead and do that now. Let's make a slightly more complex version of this that uses controllers and services, and you can see how it all ties together. So here's the beginning of that application. Everything looks pretty much like it did before. We're injecting ng-route into our module, we're calling config, using the route provider, and calling the .when commands on the route provider. And we're just passing back a couple of HTML files. I've also got a controller down here called the people controller, and that just has an array of people and a function that allows me to add people onto that array. Now, looking up at my HTML, nothing's changed on my base template HTML, but we can see list people. And all list people does is show that list of people inside of an unordered list, and then offer me an array or a link to navigate to the add person route, the add person view. Take a look at that add person HTML. And all add person does, you can see, is offer a couple of input boxes where I can key in the person's first and last name, a button that triggers that add person command from my scope, and then a hyperlink to return back to the basic list people. Now I've also got, just for demonstrative purposes, that list being repeated at the bottom of the addperson.html. Let's see this in action. The first thing you'll notice over here when I try to load it is that nothing comes up. It's totally blank, and that's true at my base URL and also at add person. Nothing's happening here. Why not? So what's going on is we need to associate that controller with those templates, and we do that like so. Here I've added a second parameter onto my configuration objects inside of my .when function. It's just a controller parameter, and it's just a string of an existing controller, people.ctrl. So that's all I need to do. Now each of these views is associated with that controller. So if I go ahead and save my JavaScript here and reload my page, now you see Ben Finkel and Sally Jones are listed. And you see my hyperlink. I can navigate to my other view, say add person. Perfect. I'll type in Jack Sparrow. Click add. You can see Jack Sparrow is now on the list. So now these two views are hooked up to that controller appropriately. And if I click return, uh-oh. What happened? Where did Jack Sparrow go? I just added him on there, right? He was there, but now he's gone. So I'd call this our first lesson in a comprehensive AngularJS application. What did we run into? We ran into the fact that the scope in the controller does not persist across views. Routing actually deletes and recreates the scope every time it loads a view. That means that we cannot use the scope inside of our controller to persist data from view to view like I just tried to do there. We have to use a service. Let's take a look at how that's done. So in order to make this work the way that I want it to, you can see what I've done is I've created a simple factory that just pumps out a people array. And that factory gets injected down here into my controller. Then all I do is I copy that array into the local scope. Pretty neat, right? It's pretty easy. Lastly, I simply copy my array back into that factory every time I add a new person. So what's happening here is the my people factory is actually the source of my array, my list of people, and the controller is only responsible for handling what's on screen at the time it's on the screen and simply logs or saves that array back into this factory. We can see it in action right here. Let's check it out. I'll go up here and change this to 4.html. And it looks the same. There's Ben Finkel, Sally Jones. I can add a person. I'll say Sam Davis. Click add. He's added on the list. Now when I return, Sam Davis, you can see persists between the two views. And that's, again, because it's being stored inside of that MyPeople service, that MyPeople factory object, as opposed to in the controller. And that's what persists across your views when you're routing. So when you're going to use routing, you got to make sure you have a good handle on factories and services and providers and how and when you want to use those as well. So to cap off this nugget, let's add in one more bit of functionality. Let's go ahead and add an edit functionality to each line on this array and an edit person page. So we'll have three views: the ability to look at the entire list of people, the ability to add new people onto that list, and the ability to edit an individual item in that list. And in order to edit an item in that list, we're going to have to use something called route parameters so that we can pass to our edit person view which particular item it is that we want to edit. Let's take a look. I'll go over each change I made to the full application one by one because there's quite a bit of them and it can be complicated to take in. So to start with, our basic layout HTML page has not changed at all. It's still just a container for the different views inside of our route. They're going to get loaded in dynamically into this container. My list people view is largely the same, except I've added this hyperlink here. And you can see that hyperlink references the $index right inside of the route that it points to. That actually gets the index of the array from my ngRepeat directive. So it's just a way for me to get the index of the array that's currently being displayed so that my edit button, that's what this hyperlink is, it reads edit, will route to the edit person / array index. And that array index is a parameter. We're going to pull that out of the route inside of our routing. You'll see that in our JavaScript. Add person is no different. I haven't made any changes there. And I've got one more HTML file called edit person. And edit person looks a lot like add person. It simply calls the update person function. And I pass in the ID because we have to know which person is being updated. So lastly, let's take a look at the JavaScript and see how this all ties together. Let's get this window stretched out so we can see the whole thing. All right. So up here in my configuration, you can see that I'm still just using when commands, but I've added a third one on here called edit person. And notice what's happening. It's not just edit person, but after the slash, I have :person ID. What the colon indicates to AngularJS is that the value that gets passed into the route after edit person / is going to be a parameter, and it's going to be stored in a value called person ID inside of the route parameters. And later, you'll see how we inject that into our controller. Otherwise, everything's exactly the same. They've each got a template URL, and I actually have created a separate controller for each one of my routes. This is really best practice, and you'll see down below how it makes my controllers a little bit simpler. Otherwise, my factory is the same, just a people array. And my first controller, list people controller, only has the copy, right? So that's a nice small, easy to debug, easy to test controller. It just copies the array into the local scope so that it can be displayed on the screen. Consequently, my add person controller doesn't have to do anything other than expose the add person function. So when you add a person, when you click that button to add a person, we just push it right onto the my people array. And then I've also added this location.path to the end of that so that once you add a person to the array, it automatically dials back, it automatically routes back to the list people. So finally, we have our edit person controller. And our edit person controller takes a new injectable called route params. We talked about this a second ago. Essentially what's happening is up here when we say :person ID, the value from the route is being added to the route params as person ID, and then I'm injecting it down into my controller so that route params person ID is now populated down here in my controller. That way I can collect the value that was in the route. So edit person /1 is going to edit the first person or the first index in the array. Edit person /2 will edit the second index in the array, etc., so on and so forth. Let's take a look at the rest of this controller. So it doesn't do much else. It populates the edit first and edit last. That's so that when you click edit, the boxes are already populated with the current values. And then the update function just updates the array and, same as before, redirects us back to list people when we're done updating. Alright, let's get a good look at all of this in action. I'm going to stretch this out so we can see everything that's going on here. So routing-5.html. There's my two people along with my two edit buttons. We can go ahead and we can add a third person. Let's put Sam Davis on here. Click add, and there's Sam Davis. Now, hey, you know what? Sam Davis is wrong. It's Sammy Davis. I better click Edit. Notice it comes up. It's repopulated. Type in my MY. Click Update. And now Sammy Davis has been updated. And I can do that with any of these. It's not Sally Jones. Maybe it's Sally James. Click Update. And there she is. Her values are updated. So notice when I click the Edit button, the value that ends up in my URL. Here is my route, and there is my person ID being passed right in through the URL. So there you have it, a full-featured 3-page, 3-view, persistent data routed application, all executed 100% on the client's PC inside of JavaScript using AngularJS. It's really a great example of showing off the power and the flexibility that AngularJS brings to your web application. All right, that concludes the nugget on AngularJS routing. We took a look at single-page routing. We talked about single-page versus multi-page routing and what those two terms mean and how single-page routing is different from, but also tries to emulate some of the functions and features of multi-page routing, which is a more traditional way of routing in your application. Then we took a look at the route provider, which is the provider service that AngularJS exposes that lets us do all this cool routing features and functionality inside of our application. We built out a small application and we slowly got more and more complicated with it to show how you can route to different views with different controllers and even persist data between those views using AngularJS routing. And then lastly, we took a look at how we can integrate route parameters into our routing so we can collect parameters right out of the URL and use them inside of our back-end code. I hope this has been informative for you, and I would like to thank you for viewing.